Welcome everyone to your program La de RH. The topic for today is how to design your culture. And for this topic, we are honored to have David Friedman with us. He's a best-selling author of Culture by Design, 8 Simple Steps to Drive Better Individual and Organizational Performance. David began to lead seminars and work with leadership teams in the areas of culture and performance. He quickly became a sought-after speaker and advisor to corporate leadership teams. In 2008, RSI was sold to a large publicly held insurance broker, and in 2010, David left the firm to more actively pursue his passion for speaking and writing. In 2011, he published his first book, Fundamentally Different, which is based on the insight he learned and taught throughout his leadership careers. Since that time, David has led more than 500 workshops, taught more than 6,000 CEOs, and worked personally with scores of organizations around the country. In 2018, he published his second book, Culture by Design, which has quickly become the go-to manual for companies looking to truly operationalize their culture. Wow, this is a very great, successful, and extensive resume. Thank you very much. Welcome, David. So excited to have you here in the program.
Thank you, Dora. Glad to be with you.
And before we start, I would like to know, how did all it started? Why it helped companies design their culture? What was the insight for all of this? Who was your mentor, your inspiration? Can you tell us a little bit about this, David?
Sure. So let me start by saying, Dora, that everything that I teach people today, that I work with companies on today, that I've written about, all comes from, as you were describing in that background, that it all comes from my experience having built my own company from 2 people to over 100 people, and having built a great organization. I learned a lot of things doing that, which I'll tell you in a moment about where that came from, but I learned a lot of things doing that, and that's what led to me then saying, wow, this is pretty good stuff, and writing my books, and that led to, one thing led to another, and I started speaking all over the country and helping lots of companies. But everything that I teach people, none of it's theoretical. All of it comes from my personal experience as a CEO and what I learned and what really works. So I'm very practical about all of this. So to your question more directly, how did this all start? It wasn't culture in the beginning. And what I mean by that, when I say that, is when our company was small, like 10 or 15 people, about 80% of those people or more were members of my own family. So I have 4 siblings, there's 5 children in my family. At one point or another, all 5 children, 4 of our spouses, 2 or 3 cousins, my best friend from high school, all worked in our company at one point or another. Later, when we sold it was only a couple family people, but there was a lot of family. And so I knew these people, I knew where they came from, I knew how they thought, I knew the way that they look at the world. When I began to hire people who weren't in my family, I had this recognition that, I can't assume that they're all going to think the way I think. They all come from different backgrounds. And so I have very high standards for how I work and how I want everybody around me working. And so I realized if I want people to do things in a certain way, I need to teach them. I can't just assume that they'll naturally do that. I got to teach. And so I started to articulate, well, what is it that I want people to do and how do I want to teach that? And so I say that to say that in those early days, I was not thinking about that as culture. I wasn't thinking, I got to build a culture. I was just thinking, I want things done in a certain way, I better teach them. And so I started to do that. It was only later that I realized, I guess that's really what culture is about, is doing things in a certain way. And so over the years, we just got better and better and better at doing that. And I'm just fanatical about whatever I do, I want to do really well. And so we built this great culture. And to your question about, a particular mentor inspiration, I actually really didn't have any. That almost everything that not that I haven't learned things from people, but I don't have that one mentor that I can say, oh, this person was my inspiration. Almost everything I've done has been very instinctive and intuitive, but I think that one of my skills, for lack of a better word, is that I'm very good at doing things instinctively, but then stopping and reflecting upon what I learned. So I would do something and it would work really well from, let's say, a leadership perspective. And then I'd stop and think, boy, that was interesting. I wonder why that worked so well. And there must be some underlying principles of leadership, of organizational behavior that are going on here. I wasn't doing them consciously, but they exist. If I could stop and I could reflect upon my experiences and begin to articulate some of those underlying principles that were at play, then I could start to teach them to people around me, so we could start doing that stuff more purposefully instead of just relying on my instincts. Because relying on your instincts is nice, but it's not the best way to grow a company. And so almost everything that I've created over the years, from the first book to everything we do today, has just been my instincts, and then stopping and reflecting upon my instincts and saying, well, what was really going on there? Because there was structure to that, even if I wasn't thinking about it. Well, what was it? So when I think about, as an example, when I sold the first company, I knew that I would always write a book about the things we had done. I always knew I would do that someday. And so the foundation, the cornerstone of my career in that first company was what we call our fundamentals, which is how we practice our culture. And I knew that someday I would write a book about these fundamentals, because they're just great stuff and they had a lot of impact for people. And so when I sat down to write that book, and I should say that when I wrote that book, very honestly, I wrote that book as a closure step. Okay. As a way of wrapping up that first career, putting it behind me so I could go on and move on and do something totally and completely different. It wasn't intended to be a launching pad. It was a closure step. So I sat down, I knew I was going to write that book just because I wanted to. And so I thought, well, what did we do in our company? Well, I guess we did this and we did this and we did this. And I created what I call the 8-step framework, which is how we organize the steps that it takes to drive a culture. But those 8 steps, I didn't know them in advance and work them. Those 8 steps came out of my reflecting upon what we had done. We were doing those things. And when I thought, well, what did we do? Well, I guess we defined it, and we created rituals, and we selected the best people, and we did these 8 different things. And so that became the 8-step framework. So the 8-step framework was a reflection of what I had done. It wasn't something that I designed from the beginning. And now it's taken on a whole life of its own. That's been very useful for people, but it's kind of a little bit of a different origin to it all.
Wow, David, that's very interesting, because when you go and do a lot of things, and then you don't stop and reflect what you're doing because of this, we don't have time, right? We don't have time to stop and check what we're doing. So it's awesome that you actually do this to check on not only on you, on your companies, on your people, on everyone around you. So I wanted to ask you, can you explain to us, why is it important to have a great culture, and how does culture actually happen? Should we just expect for culture to happen, or should we create the culture that we want?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dora. So the first thing I would say is so let's take those one at a time. The reason that culture is, there's a lot of reasons that culture is really critical. And I'll just give you top 3. So first is, not necessarily in this order, but first reason is that it has an enormous impact on the ability to attract and retain the kind of people you want. You're not going to have a great company if you don't have great people, and people are attracted to companies that have a great culture. And that's even more so today. It's always been true, but it's even more so today, given the younger generation entering the workforce. It's important to them to go to a company that they feel aligned with, that they feel connected to. And they'll go for less money. And that's not an excuse to pay them less, but they'll go for less money because they want to be with a company that they feel aligned to. I think the second thing is that most of us exist in, I sometimes say, commoditized environments. And what I mean by that phrase is, whatever it is that we're selling, whatever product we sell, whatever service we sell, there are lots of competitors who sell the exact same thing. And it becomes very difficult to differentiate ourselves compared to these other people. Well, you come out with some new product and you're the only one in your marketplace that has it, pretty soon all your competitors copy it and they have the same thing. Yeah. And so it's very difficult to differentiate. But if you could get your people to be better than everybody else's people, not in the product, but in how they do things and how they work with each other, how they work with customers, how they work with vendors, not only is that the biggest competitive advantage you could create in this look-alike commoditized kind of world, but I always say it's the most sustainable competitive advantage. Because even when your competitors realize you're winning because your people are better, it's really hard for them to copy it. And so it becomes very important. So the third reason that working on culture is so critical is it affects how people perform. That I always say that people exist on the typical bell curve, where on one end of the spectrum, if you think about any company and its employees, you've got typically about 5 or 10% of people who I call these people rock stars. These are the people you could put them in any environment and they're going to be amazing no matter what, because they're just great people. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got 5 or 10% of your people who I would say they're going to stink no matter where you put them. They're just not very good. But in between, you've got like 80% of your people who will go with the flow. If you put those employees or anybody in a high performing environment where everybody in the environment is really playing to at a high level, those people will look around and they'll figure, I guess that's what we do here, and they'll match what they see going on around them. And you put the exact same people, with whatever their skills, talent, knowledge, ability, experiences, put the same people in a low performing environment, and they'll just sink to the level of the people around them, because the environment has this enormous influence. So if we understand that, what that suggests to me, to go to your earlier question about should we be intentional about this? Well, gee, if it's going to have that much impact over our success, why would I leave that to chance? I got to be intentional about that. And what's interesting is most companies aren't. And if we're not intentional, where culture comes from, when you asked earlier, so how does culture develop? In the absence of us being intentional and systematic about it, where culture comes from most of the time is it comes from influential personalities. And what I mean by that is, if you think about, I'll say it this way, that every group of people that comes together has a culture. Whether it's a company, whether it's a church group, whether it's a sports team, whether it's a group of friends, people come together and cultures form. So if you or any of your audience members, if you picture a group of friends of yours that you get together with and do things with, there's a culture in the group. There's a way that you do things. There are things that are okay to joke about and things that's not okay to joke about. And there are just styles and the ways that you relate to each other. And if you're not purposely doing something, what happens in those groups normally, just normal pattern, is that in every group of people, there are some who are leaders. It's just their personality. Just by the nature of their personality, they emerge as leaders of the group. They're the ones that the whole group's getting together, group of friends, and we're trying to decide what time we should meet for dinner. And somebody says, how about you guys want to meet at 6? How about we do 6 o'clock? Does that work for everybody? Well, who said 6 o'clock? It was the leader. Somebody steps up and kind of sets the tone, and everybody else follows suit. And these leaders are the ones influencing the culture. Now, the reason that I like to point this out to people is that I would tell you that if you don't do something about it, if you as a leader don't create the culture, it's going to get created anyway, and it's going to mostly get created by the strongest personalities in your company. And those people, by the way, aren't necessarily the designated managers, supervisors, and leaders in your company. They're just the people who happen to have strong personalities. And if those people just happen to be really positive, enthusiastic, hardworking, quality-oriented kind of people, gee, everything's going to work out great. But if they're not, if some of those influential personalities happen to be jerks with lousy attitudes, those jerks are going to influence the people around them to be more like them. And if we go back to your question earlier, if we understand how important our culture is to the performance of our people, why would I leave that to just the whims or the luck of the draw of whoever happened to be coincidentally the strongest personalities? I wouldn't want to do that. You know, if it's that important, I'd want to make sure I'm taking control over that and creating the culture I want to have. And that's why we have to be systematic about it. That's kind of a long answer to your question, but
no,
yes.
I love it, David. And I think it's very important for the audience and everyone that's hearing us to understand the importance of culture, and that every CEO has to have this as a very specific strategy for that, because the
Yes.
impact that the culture has in the company is a lot. So you, as you said earlier, you cannot just leave it to whatever it happens. And talking about that, when should we worry about the company's culture? When we are building the company, when the company has X amount of employees? What can you tell us about this?
You know, there's an old proverb that you've probably heard before. I think it's like a Chinese proverb or something. And the proverb goes something like this. I won't quote this perfectly, but when is the best time to plant a tree? And the answer is 50 years ago. And when's the second best time? Today. And I think the same is relevant as it relates to your question about culture. When should I be working on that? Well, yeah, it would have been nice to have worked on it 20 years ago. We'd be in a different place today if we hadn't, but we can only start where we are. And so it's never too late. You should, like today you should start working on it. Because again, if we understand how much importance it has, if I was starting my company, I'm building a brand new company. Yeah, one of the first things I do is I would establish right from the beginning, this is the way we're going to do things. This is the culture we're going to have. But okay, I didn't start it, and I'm now 20 years in, and we got people, and we got things going on. All right, well, let's start right now. It's, the sooner the better. We don't have to wait for anything.
Okay, that's great. And what have you found in the CEOs and C-suite that you have worked with, that I know there are a lot, when talking about culture? Is it an important topic for them? Is it part of their strategy? Do they really understand the impact and importance of the culture in their companies, as you were talking earlier?
Here's what I would say, Dora. I would say that they do understand the impact, but they don't have a strategy about it. Now, that may sound strange, but I'll kind of show you why. So when I do my workshops for CEOs, there's a little sort of exercise, for lack of a better word, that I sometimes do with them. And it's kind of revealing. And I'll have a bunch of CEOs together, and I'll ask them, okay, let's cut through this stuff. Let's get down to the dollars and cents, the real money here. On a 1 to 5 scale, how important would you say that culture is to your bottom line, to making money? With 1 being, it's not that big a deal at all. 5 being, oh, it's a really important part of making money. And I go around the room and I ask everybody where they would rate it. And almost all the CEOs will tell me it's a 4 or a 5 on a 5-point scale in terms of its impact. Sometimes, actually almost always, there's at least one person in the audience who tells me it's like a 7 or an 8 on a 5-point scale. So they get that, yeah, this is really important. And then I ask them this, I say, so, okay, we understand how important it is. How many of you have some sort of a written strategic plan that identifies this year's targets and quotas and this year's strategic initiatives and priorities, what you want to accomplish as a company? And most of them raise their hand, they have that. And then I ask them, how many of you have some sort of a written sales plan that documents this, your company's sales targets and quotas and how you're going to get your sales numbers? And most of them have that. And then I ask them, so how many of you have some sort of a financial plan, a budget, a forecast? And obviously they all have that. And then I say to them, so how many of you have some sort of a documented written culture plan? And almost nobody does. And I say, well, wait a second, let me see if I understand this. You just told me that this was a 5 in terms of its impact on the bottom line, and yet you have no plan for how you're executing on how to do it. That seems kind of odd. That would be like saying about our finances, that budget, we don't need any of that stuff. That's overrated. And if we didn't have a budget or a forecast, that doesn't mean, by the way, that we wouldn't still be trying to generate enough revenue, or we still wouldn't be trying to manage our expenses the best we can. But our chances of hitting our numbers would be a heck of a lot less if I had no plan than if I did have one. And the same is true of our culture. That the fact that we don't have a formal structured plan about it doesn't mean it's not important to us, doesn't mean we don't care, or that we're not trying to do things. But the chances that we would be building a fantastic culture would be a heck of a lot better if I had some structured, systematic plan about how to go about it than if I was just hoping it worked out. And then that kind of, I hadn't really thought about it like that before. So they know it's important, but they have no plan. And when I ask them, so why don't you have a plan? The answers I hear most frequently are, they'll say things like, never occurred to me. It's a lot easier in other areas. So it's easy to talk about our numbers. We could talk about finances, we could talk about sales, we could talk about operations. Those are concrete, they're tangible. I could talk about that all day. Talking about the people part of our business, I don't even know what to say about it. It's hard to get our arms around. It's hard to measure it in any way. And so they go to where they're comfortable. They're comfortable in places that they know, that they can measure. And here it's a lot harder. And yet this is where the biggest opportunity for impact is. There's an interesting study. One of my favorite authors is Patrick Lencioni. I don't know if you've read some of his books.
No.
He's a great author. And all of his books, except for one, are written as a fable format, like the 1 Minute Manager series, where he tells a story, and through the story, he illustrates his points. And they're great books. They're short. They're really to the point. But in 2012, he wrote his only book that's totally nonfiction. And it's called The Advantage. And the subtitle of it is Why Organizational Health Trumps Everything Else in Business. And what he says is that he's a research kind of junkie, and he looks at all these different companies, and he looks at what it takes to be successful. And what he says is, based on all his research, he says there are two things it takes to be really successful. The first, and they're both required. The first is you have to be really smart. And by smart, he's talking about the traditional business disciplines. You have to have good finance and operations and marketing and all those things. And then he says the second thing is you have to be healthy. And by healthy, he's referring to the culture. You have to have a highly functioning group of people. And they're both required. But of the two, the one he says has the far, far greater contribution to our success is the healthy stuff. And the reason he says that is that no matter how brilliant your strategy is, you're only going to go as far as your people take you. If you've got a brilliant strategy, but you've got a screwed up, dysfunctional group of people, you're never going to get very far with it. And conversely, if you've got a highly functioning group of people, you're going to take that strategy and you're going to go 5 or 10 times as far with it. So ultimately, it's the health of the company, that the culture, that has the biggest influence of success. But then again, he's this research guy, and he looks at he does this big study to see where do most CEOs spend most of their time, on the smart stuff or the healthy stuff. And of course, on the smart stuff, because that's what's comfortable. That's what they know. That's what they're familiar with. And so that's where they spend their time. And yet the biggest opportunity to have a real impact is on the healthy stuff. But it's a very uncomfortable area for them, because prior to my work, there really isn't, other than my work, there really isn't a structure, a system to do it. Yes. And really what I've been able to do is to take culture, that soft, squishy people part of it, and make it systematic and practical and actionable so we can do something about it. And when they hear it, it's like the light bulb goes off for them, because it's the first time they've ever seen somebody make culture real and practical and tangible instead of a bunch of fluffy stuff.
Yeah, and really actually, I read your book. I loved it. I have it here with me. It's all underlined, and I found it really easy to understand, as you just said, the 8-step framework that you explain in there: define, ritualize, select, integrate, communicate, coach, lead, and drive. And to all the audience that is listening or watching this interview, can you give us a little bit about the summary about these steps that you mentioned in your book, and why did you choose these steps?
Well, again, remember that when you ask the question of why did I choose them, and I'll come back and talk about them a little bit, but why did I choose them? They were just, I was reflecting upon what I had done. Okay. And candidly, being very honest here, when I wrote my first book, Fundamentally Different, as I said before, I always knew I would write that book. And it was, the goal was to write a book about my original 30 fundamentals that we practiced in my company, which was called RSI. And so I knew I would write a book about each of those fundamentals. And so there was a natural structure of, okay, I got 30 fundamentals, there'll be a chapter on each one of them. Great. But I needed some context, I can't write a book that says, okay, here's fundamental number 1, because the reader doesn't even know what a fundamental is. So I need to give it some context. So I was actually literally in the shower, where I do my best thinking. I'm not going to give you a picture of that, but, and I was sitting there thinking, you know what? I need to give this context. Like, what did we do in our company? Well, I guess the first thing we did is we defined what we wanted our culture to be. And then we created these rituals, and then we tried to be really good about picking the right people, and then we integrated them. And I just thought of the 8 things we did, and that became the 8-step framework. So like that's where it came from. It just came from me thinking about the things that we had done. And then, and even in the first book, they're actually drawn differently. So you saw on the book Culture by Design, there's the circle on the cover as the 8-step framework. In the first book, fundamentally different, those 8 steps are just listed in a list, just 1 through 8. There's no circle drawing. And the order was actually different. Number 1 was defining, and number 5 was creating rituals. And I used to do these talks, and I would list the 8 steps, 1 through 8, and then I'd highlight 1 and 5 and say, these are the 2 most important ones. And then I thought, well, that's kind of stupid. Why do I have number 1 and 5 being the most important? They don't have to be in this order just because I thought of them that way in the shower. And so I started to I created that circle and just changed the order. So number 1 and 2 were at the center of the circle. But originally it was just a list of items. So anyway, so the 8-step framework really came from just my reflecting upon what we had done and just trying to organize what I had done in a way that's easier for people to understand. And, as I think about this, I made the comment earlier that thankfully one of my gifts or strengths is the ability to kind of reflect upon experiences and articulate what I learned, the lessons learned, and organize them in a way that becomes easier for other people to understand. And that's really what I did with the 8-step framework, was simply to think about what I had done around my culture and think, how could I organize that in a way that I could teach it to other people so they could say, oh, yeah, that's really helpful. That gives me a way of thinking about this that makes it easier for me to understand. And that's all I've really done with all of my material, is just think about, how can I organize ideas and thoughts in a way that I could give it to somebody, and because I gave it to them in an organized way, it's easier for them to learn it and understand it. So that's kind of where the 8-step framework came from. So those 8 steps, to your question, I always say the 2 that are in the middle of that drawing are the most important, and those 2 represent probably 80 or 90% of the impact. If you do those 2 things well, you are well on your way to success. And if you don't do those things well, you don't get very far. And those are, number 1, how you go about defining exactly what you want the culture to be. Because if you don't define that clearly enough, you're never going to be able to build it. You've got to have that clarity. And when we talk about how to do that, I'll come back to this in a little bit, but when we talk about how to do that, I'm very different from most people in that I make a very big deal about a distinction between what I call values and what I call behaviors. And this distinction is one of the most important parts of all of my material. So I'll come back to that and just go deeper on that in a moment. So the first step is defining a set of behaviors that's what we want this culture to be. The second step is this whole idea of what I call rituals, creating rituals. And a ritual is some routine that we do that just becomes baked into how we operate. And the reason that rituals are so important is that they enable us to sustain things. In the absence of something becoming a ritual, or I use the word habit almost interchangeably with that, in the absence of it being a habit or a ritual, we get all excited, we get really motivated, and then we get busy and everything falls apart. And for 3 weeks, we're doing it, and then we forget about it. When it becomes a ritual, it's not hard to do. It's just what we do. So that's why rituals are so important. So if we can define the behaviors that are really important to us, and then we can create with rituals, we can create a structured, systematic way to practice those behaviors over and over and over and over and over again, those behaviors start to become second nature. They become internalized. And that's really the essence of the idea, is define in really clear terms the behaviors that are important, that drive success, and then create a structured, systematic way to teach them over and over through rituals. You do that, you're going to be successful. The other 6 steps are all elements, and they're all important, but those 2 are the critical ones. The other 6, very briefly, are step 3 is, how do we select people who are going to be a good fit for the culture that we're building? Because we're never going to build a high-performing organization with people who don't fit. They've got to be a fit in the culture, and there's a whole series of material on how to do that. The 4th step is what I call integration. Integration is the word I use for how do we take the people we just hired and how do we bring them into the organization? And I use that word because it's kind of a word of assimilation. You know, I often say that the first day that somebody spends in our company is just about the most important day in their whole career, because this is where they pick up the expectations about how things work around here. So integration is all about orchestrating every aspect of a new person's experience in our company so that we get them off to the right start and they understand our culture. The fifth step in the overall framework is what I call making the culture visible or communicating it. And it's about all the different signage and ways that people, everywhere they go around the place, they should see things about our culture. The more they see things about it, the more we're talking about it, the more it becomes our vocabulary, the more we're thinking about it. The sixth step is what I call coaching. And coaching is how do we use the day-to-day situations that come up in our companies to teach and reinforce the culture. And specifically, it's teaching using the language of our culture. Every time we use the specific language and vocabulary that we've established for our culture, every time we use that language in the teaching and coaching that we're doing with team members, we're pulling it off the wall and we're making it real and relevant and meaningful. The seventh step is what I call the leadership example, that we could talk about this stuff all day long. We could put beautiful signs on the walls, but at the end of the day, what the leaders do tells people a lot more about our culture than anything else. And so leaders have to be great examples of it. They don't have to be perfect, but they've got to be pretty darn good examples. Otherwise, there's no credibility around it. And the eighth step is what I call creating accountability. And creating accountability is how do we show people that we're serious about our culture? And that includes everything from putting it in our performance reviews, to surveying, to hold ourselves accountable to what we say we stand for, to things as significant as getting rid of people who don't fit. I mean, every company always has some people who are a lousy fit in the culture and act in ways that are opposite of our culture, except they bring in a lot of business, or they have specialized knowledge, or they've been here for a long time and we're afraid to get rid of them. And when we're afraid to get rid of those people, we're basically undermining everything we're trying to teach. And so getting rid of some of those people is one of the strongest ways to show accountability. So those are the 8 steps. But again, I never want people to lose the forest for the trees. The core of it is define in crystal clear terms the behaviors that drive success, and then using rituals, create a structured, systematic way to teach those behaviors over and over and over again. You do that, and people are going to internalize the culture.
Okay, and David, I have a question also. In these unprecedented times where many companies are working remotely and some are even changing their strategy, their products, how can we maintain a great culture? Should we build a new one? What is your opinion?
Well, I think that the question of whether the sort of a whether we should and then how, whether we should build a new culture depends entirely on how effective the current culture is. In most cases, there's no need to build a new culture. We just need to use different tools to connect people. So as I think about, for example, my company's culture is defined in terms of the behaviors that are important to us. And I give these behaviors a name. I call them fundamentals because I think they're fundamental to success. So some of our fundamentals are things like honor commitments, practice blameless problem solving, get clear on expectations, do what's best for the client, listen generously. These are the behaviors that we teach, and there are many others. Well, the fact that we're all working remotely doesn't change any of that. I don't need to, and it's no less or more important than it's ever been to make sure we're honoring all our commitments, or we're practicing blameless problem solving, or anything else. So all of those behaviors are as relevant today as they were a year ago, as they will be a year from now. What changes is, okay, do I need some new tools in order to teach those because we're working remotely? So the culture doesn't have to change. It's just, what are the methods we use? So as an example, and we were doing this before the pandemic anyway, but one of the most important tools we use to engage people in our culture is a mobile app that we developed about a year ago. And the mobile app gives people all kinds of ways that every single day they're thinking about and talking about our fundamental of the week. And every day they get a push notification with a quick tip related to this week's fundamental. They get, every day they see a message that goes out from somebody in the company and people are commenting on it or liking it. They can acknowledge each other through the app when they see people living to the fundamental. There are video tutorials for the fundamental of the week on the app. There are teaching points and coaching tips and questions for discussion. And the app creates all these many, many different ways that they can engage in their fundamental when they can use it whether we're together or not, but especially when we're working remotely and we're not physically together, we need tools like that to connect people to their culture. And the app becomes one of the greatest tools to do that. So there are things like that that create great tools, but that's not a change of the culture. It's just a change of how we practice it. That makes sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And if someone, you said earlier that the best time to create your culture is today, if you don't have one strategy for it. If someone decides today that they want to design their culture, where should they start? And more if they're working remotely, of course, first they have to read your book, email you for help, of course. And
Of course.
what recommendations can you tell the audience?
Well, I would say that the first step, the very first step after calling me, the first step is that they should define what they want their culture to be. I mean, it's the first step in the 8-step framework for a reason. If we don't have clarity about exactly what we want our culture to be, there's nothing else to do. I mean, we can't hire people who are going to be a good fit for our culture if I don't know what a good fit is, because I don't know what's the culture I'm trying to create. So everything comes out of the clarity of understanding what is the culture we want to create. So that has to be the starting point. Now, in doing that, I referred to this earlier, but I didn't go back to more detail. When we talk about defining it, I do make a very big deal, and I referred to this earlier, about the difference between what I call values and what I call behaviors, because I think they're different from each other. And I think the difference is more than just semantics. I think it's really important. Mm-hmm. So let me explain what that difference is and why it's important, because it's relevant for where the starting point should be. So a value to me is an abstract concept. So examples of values are things like quality, integrity, respect, loyalty, service. These are ideas, they're concepts. A behavior, in contrast, is an action. It's something I can literally see people doing. So I mentioned before some of the behaviors that we teach in our company, and they're things like be a fanatic about response time, honor commitments, get clear on expectations, do what's best for the client, practice blameless problem solving. These are all actions or things that you do. So a value is a concept, an action is a behavior. I mean, behavior is an action. So in parts of speech, I think of it almost like a value is a noun, a behavior is a verb. It's a thing versus an action. Now, why does that matter? Who cares? Well, here's why this is actually important. The problem with the way most companies that you're listening to this, that you've seen or worked with, the problem with the way most companies go about defining their culture is that they come up with this vision statement and this mission statement that are usually pretty fluffy. And then they come up with a set of core values, and the values are so abstract that they mean too many different things to too many different people, and they become very difficult to operationalize. So I'll give you a simple example. One of the values that many companies will have is they'll have the value for respect. We should all respect each other. And that sounds like a perfectly good thing. Who would argue with that? But what does that word mean? It means something, what it looks like to show somebody respect may be very different in Mexico than it is in New Jersey. It may be different in one family versus another. If you grew up in an inner city gang, what respect looks like to you could be different than what it looks like in my family or anybody else's. We all have different countries have different ideas of what respect is. And so simply saying, well, we value respect, okay, sounds great. I just don't know if it's all that useful. Behaviors, because they're a lot more action-oriented, are a lot easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. They're easier to operationalize. And so I tell people to define their culture not in terms of this broad set of values, but rather in terms of the behaviors that you say, if we could get our people doing these behaviors more consistently, we'd be even more successful than we are today. And again, I give those behaviors a name. It's just my title. I call them fundamentals because I think they're fundamental to success. So to answer your question, the starting point should be figure out what are the fundamentals, what are the behaviors that you say, if we could get everybody doing these behaviors, we're going to be even more successful. That has to be the first step.
Okay. And what are some of the do's and don'ts about creating a company cultures? Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Do it right and don't do it wrong.
That's a great
No,
one.
I would say a few of the mistakes I see companies make sometimes. I would say the first mistake is that too often they make the process too collaborative. Now that may sound surprising because people think, well, shouldn't we get everybody involved in this so that they all own it? And my point of view is that the authorship of what culture you want should come from leadership. If I'm the CEO, I'm trying to create the culture that will build the kind of company that's my vision to build. I'm not building the culture that all of my employees would like to see. I mean, that's not what I'm doing. I'm designing the culture around what I want to build and getting people who want to go there. If some of my people aren't interested in what I'm trying to build, they probably should work somewhere else. So it's a leadership function. It's not, let's see what all the employees would like to have. No, it's what I want the company to be, and I'm going to get people to go there. So a mistake I see companies make is over collaborating and trying to please everybody instead of making sure it's a leadership function. I would say another mistake I see companies make is that too often they try to write fancy, fluffy things that sound all wonderful, except don't mean anything. And I'm always about keep it real, be down to earth. What are the things that you say are really important there? And write them in the simplest possible ways. I also would tell you that I see the development of culture as the writing of it as largely an internally focused exercise. And what I mean by that is the audience for what we're writing is our employees. I mean, we're writing it as a leadership group, but we're writing it for our employees. We're not writing it for our customers. And so that doesn't mean we don't want our customers to see it. I'm totally fine with them seeing it, but I would write it differently if I was writing to a customer audience versus writing to my own company's audience. And so I think it's important to use language and phrases that people connect to, that are meaningful, that are real for people. So I want people to keep it down to earth, keep it practical, keep it relevant, use words and phrases that are how normal people talk. We don't have to over engineer this. Keep it simple.
And also, what success stories can you share with us today when companies really design their culture and make it part of their business strategy?
Dora, there's so many of them that many of our clients will tell me that working on this, implementing the system that I teach is the single most impactful thing they've done in the history of their company. I hear that many times. That it changes the way people relate to each other. It changes there's tremendous power in the impact of a common language. And what the fundamentals do is they give everybody the same language to speak. So when we say, hey, remember, we got to practice blameless problem solving right now. Oh, I know what that means. And so there's just a lot of power to when we all use the same phrases, the same language. I remember there was a guy that taught me a lot about communication many years ago. And he used to say that what we do in many companies is, the analogy would be, it's like we come in and imagine if we had a company, let's say it's an international company, and we come in and you speak Spanish and I speak German and somebody else speaks French and somebody else speaks Swahili. And when we come into work, it's very difficult to understand each other. And then instead we say, you know what, regardless of whatever language you grew up with, let's all agree that when we come in, let's speak Swedish for argument's sake. And we're all going to learn Swedish. And when we're in work, we're all going to speak Swedish. Okay, once we have a common language, it's a lot easier for us to communicate with each other. I think of the fundamentals in a somewhat analogous way, that we all grew up in families of different backgrounds and different experiences where we used language in different ways. And the word, like my example of respect, what respect meant in one family was different from what it looks like in a different family. So when we all say we got to respect each other, I don't know that we mean the same thing. But if we create this invented language of our fundamentals and we're all using that same terminology, we all know because we've defined it, this is what it means. And now we have the power of that common language with each other. So it's one of the very big impacts. I would tell you another big impact, and I've seen this many times, is that many of our employees in my own company and our clients will tell me that practicing fundamentals has had as big or bigger impact on their personal lives and relationships as it has at work. That if you learn to be, some of my fundamentals are just such humanistic things. If we learn to be better listeners, more generous listeners, or to have straighter, more honest conversations, or to get clear on expectations, or to practice blameless problem solving, or we're better at honoring the commitments we made to our spouse. I mean, these things, if we're doing these things at home, they're going to have an enormous impact on our relationships. And many people tell me that practicing fundamentals has changed their personal lives as much as it has their business lives. So it works everywhere.
Wow, David, that's awesome because you impact in both ways, in personal and in the professional life, right?
Very much so.
If you could describe the importance of designing a company's culture in one word, what would it be, David?
If I had to choose one word, Dora,
Yeah.
it would be the word intentionality.
Attention.
That when I look at the difference between reasonably successful people and amazing people, and reasonably successful companies and amazing companies, what I find is that it's all about being intentional. And what I mean by that is, if you look at, let's talk about athletes. If you look at the athletes that are really good, most of them are very naturally talented and they work reasonably hard, and it's helped them to get to a certain level. If you look at world-class athletes, everything they do is intentional. They eat in a certain way, they train in a certain way, they sleep a certain number of hours. Every aspect of how they organize their time in their life is very purposeful. So yes, they have talent, yes, they work hard, but they're very intentional about everything that they do. I think the same is true as it relates to culture and as it relates to companies, that it's really being intentional versus just trying to do the best you can. It elevates the game. There's a quote that I think it's in Culture by Design. It used to be on my website, but it's my favorite quote about this topic, and it's relevant to your question. And the quote, which I wrote many years ago, was, it said that, and it relates to the title of the book too, in fact. The quote is that good companies have good cultures by chance, but world-class companies have world-class cultures by design. And what I mean when I say that good companies have good cultures by chance, what I'm saying is, if you're a good leader, you're naturally going to do most of the right stuff. This isn't rocket science. You're going to hire good people. You're going to treat them reasonably well, not because you read a book or heard Dora interview somebody that said, oh, you should treat your people well. You wouldn't know how else to do it. You're a good person. You're going to do that. And if you do that, you're going to have a decent company and a decent culture, and you're going to be fine. You're not going to fail. I mean, I often say that what I teach people, that this whole system that I teach people is, believe it or not, is not the difference between success and failure. It isn't, because a lot of your audience members have been successful and haven't been doing this. This isn't the difference between being successful and failing. This is the difference between being successful and being extraordinary, because that's a whole different game. That while good companies have good cultures by chance, the best companies understand just how important their culture is. And so they don't leave any of it to chance. Instead, they're incredibly intentional and purposeful and systematic about how they author and create and drive the culture they want through the organization. It's all about just raising the game by being more intentional.
I like that. I like that, David. And if you could help me complete the following statement, I consider myself a successful person
When I help others to understand concepts that they might not have understood before.
Okay, awesome. I like that also. And well, David, I thank you very much again for being here with us today. I really appreciate it. And I hope that after this conversation, more and more companies can actually understand the importance of really designing a great culture by intention and can have it as a strategy for their companies to grow. If people want to know more about your company and services, where can they go to, David?
Best place to go would be my website, which is culturewise.com. And that's all one word. So culture and then wise, W-I-S-E, all one word, culturewise.com. There's simple videos, simple explanations. The whole turnkey system we've created is all right there. Very simple, very easy, very inexpensive, but that's the best place to go.
Okay, well, thank you, David. Thanks again. Thanks for
My
sharing
pleasure.
your experience, and thank you for being with us today.
You're very welcome, Dora.
Thank you. Bye-bye.